When lives are lost in moments of political upheaval, the instinct is to look for a single villain, a regime to condemn or a leader to blame. Yet tragedies of this scale rarely have one author. They emerge from a toxic convergence of authoritarian power at home, opportunistic power abroad, misinformation, misplaced hope, and a global system that rewards ruthlessness far more reliably than compassion. The question of whom to blame, therefore, cannot be answered with a single name. Responsibility is layered, and each layer reflects a different failure of leadership. Authoritarian regimes bear primary culpability. When governments respond to dissent with violence rather than dialogue, they forfeit moral legitimacy. They often cloak repression in the language of stability or national security, but this usually masks a simpler truth: the fear of losing power. In such systems, ordinary people become expendable, not because their lives lack value, but because their suffering is politically inconvenient. Yet stopping there is dangerously incomplete. Foreign powers form another layer of responsibility. Major global players frequently speak the language of freedom while quietly calculating how instability might serve their interests. They amplify protests when useful, impose sanctions when convenient, and look away when engagement becomes costly. International politics often resembles a stage where moral language is costume rather than conviction. Populist leaders in powerful nations have refined this performative morality. They present themselves as champions of the oppressed and rail against tyranny, but their actions often contradict their rhetoric. Promises of support evaporate when they conflict with economic or strategic priorities. Words become fireworks, bright, dramatic, and hollow. This creates a particularly cynical failure of leadership. When influential figures encourage protesters or hint at intervention, they raise expectations that shape real behavior. People take risks based on what they believe powerful outsiders might do. When those signals prove empty, the consequences are borne by citizens, not the leaders who spoke them. Many political elites, regardless of ideology, view foreign crises primarily through the lens of resources, leverage, or domestic politics. Oil, trade routes, alliances, and military positioning often outweigh human rights. In this context, humanitarian language becomes a tool rather than a commitment. This points to a deeper problem: the personalization of power. Governance in many countries has shifted from institutions to individuals, where decisions reflect personal instincts, interests, and ego more than collective deliberation. When power is concentrated in small circles of family members or loyalists, national interest blurs into private interest. Foreign policy becomes another arena for deal-making and enrichment. This pattern is global, not confined to any one country. We see leaders who cloak self-enrichment in nationalism, strong men who claim to protect while crushing dissent, and elected figures who erode institutions from within. Different flags, same logic of power. The result is an erosion of trust. When leaders overpromise and underdeliver, citizens become cynical. Solidarity appears tactical, outrage selective, and morality negotiable. This breeds apathy and, paradoxically, makes societies more vulnerable to demagogues who promise certainty amid chaos. Yet cynicism is not a solution. The deeper challenge is redefining leadership. True leadership is not measured by volume, bravado, or theatrical condemnation, but by consistency, accountability, and a willingness to bear political costs for ethical principles. Genuine concern for human life is shown through diplomacy, coalition building, humanitarian protections, and restraint, not just rhetoric. International responsibility also requires more than sanctions or symbolic gestures. It demands sustained engagement, support for civil society, long-term stability, and humility about the limits of external influence. Intervention, rhetorical or military, can have devastating unintended consequences. At the same time, domestic accountability remains essential. No foreign actor can replace internal movements demanding rights, transparency, and reform. External pressure can influence outcomes, but lasting change ultimately comes from within societies. So who bears responsibility for lost lives? It is shared, though not equal. Authoritarian regimes that violently suppress dissent carry primary blame. But foreign leaders who exploit unrest, incite without commitment, or prioritize resources over people also bear moral responsibility, as do global systems that reward instability when it benefits the powerful. What should disturb us most is not only the deaths themselves, but the normalization of such losses as collateral damage. When suffering becomes just another variable in strategic calculations, humanity is diminished. The challenge is therefore not merely to assign blame, but to demand better from leaders, institutions, and international systems. We need political cultures that value truth over spectacle, cooperation over confrontation, and human dignity over profit. Words must be matched by actions. Until that happens, tragedies will repeat. Populations will remain trapped between repressive governments at home and indifferent powers abroad, with hopes raised and abandoned whenever they conflict with national interest. The ultimate lesson is sobering. In a cynical world of power, people cannot rely on distant saviors or rhetorical allies. Accountability must be demanded locally and collectively, while global publics hold their own leaders to higher ethical standards. Only when leadership is grounded in empathy, transparency, and restraint can we meaningfully reduce the human cost of political conflict. Until then, the question of whom to blame will remain painfully relevant and disturbingly complex.